I'm Ermite. I'm Ermite St. Jacques. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies. And I just want to welcome you all today. Our program is Haiti's Independence Debt, Conversation with New York Times reporters Catherine Porter and Constant Méheut. Unfortunately, Catherine couldn't be with us today, and so we have Constant. And Constant Méheut reports for the New York Times in France. He joined the Paris bureau in January 2020. Constant graduated from HEC Business School in Paris and MGIMO School of International Relations in Moscow with a dual master's degree in business and international relations. He also holds a master's degree in political philosophy at the Sorbonne University in Paris. Thank you, Constant, for being with us. And we know you're in Paris and we know the time difference. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Ermite.
So I guess I'll just get started. The Haitian ransom and debt is really a little known topic. No one talks about it. And so I'm curious, how did this topic come about? What was the idea behind
that? It was really the brainchild of my colleague, Catherine Porter, who unfortunately, as you pointed out, cannot be here tonight. But Catherine, who is now based in Paris, used to be based in Canada. And from there, she has covered Haiti a lot over the past decade after the first natural catastrophes. She went there, I think, for the first time in 2010. And as a foreign correspondent, she had that questions in her mind that came on and on about why that country is so poor. How is it that it is often or perhaps always referred to as the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and there are many responses to that. We often refer to corruption, endemic violence, natural disasters, but there was also a response that she heard while in Haiti, which was, Haiti didn't start on an equal footing compared to other Latin American countries. And that was obviously a reference to that independence debt that Haiti paid to France for much of the 19th century. So she became curious about that debt. She went back to Canada, wrote to our editors and said, look, maybe there's something to do there. Initially, it was not supposed to be this sort of big 5-part project, but then editors thought, well, as you pointed out, this is a story that is not known apart from scholars, historians, and people in Haiti, but people in France, people in the US do not know about that story, which is also a unique case of reparations that went to the former colonizers and not to the former colony. And so very soon, that project became something around not only telling that history, doing some research into archives, books, talking to historians, but also trying to, I would say, move that story further by tracing the money and by trying to estimate how much Haiti had actually paid to France, because whenever we were reading books and research papers, we would find only very broad estimates or stray figures about how much was paid. So it was literally impossible to say how that debt had affected Haiti's economic development over time. And to us, that was kind of the main questions, right? Like, how does a debt that was paid in the 19th century has affected the development of a country for the past 2 centuries? It was ambitious, but it was, I think, a great question. So that's how the project started and how it was designed from the origins.
As you mentioned, it was different parts. And I know that as a team of reporters, each of you had a particular section, and you worked on the economics of it in terms of the debt itself. And can you tell us a little bit about, I guess, the challenge of, tracing the money or, trying to calculate this debt and then the impact of this debt?
Sure. So as I said, when we started working on that project, we very quickly realized that we would find only stray figures or broad estimates of the debt. And initially, to be honest, we thought that we would find some decent or solid estimates, of what Haiti had paid to France for decades. We realized that was not the case. And so we thought, well, we have to do it ourselves, basically. We have to collect the data and estimate how much Haiti had paid to France for decades. Just to make things a little bit clearer, when we talk about Haiti's debt, we talk about Haiti's double debt. What this is about is Haiti in 1825 first agreed and to some extent was forced to pay France what was called an indemnity of 150 million francs to repay the former colonizers. That indemnity represented about 3 times Haiti's GDP at the time in 1825. So that was really a huge amount. And Haiti, for sure, did not have the means to pay that indemnity. So they contracted a loan of 30 million francs to pay the first part of that indemnity. And that came to form what we call the double debt, right? The indemnity and the loan to pay for the first installment of that indemnity. We focused on that double debt, which was really the original debt. I'll talk later about some other loans that were contracted directly or partly because of that double debt. What we started to do was to collect the data on how much was paid each year. What we found was that we had to go into archives in France, in the US, in Haiti. We had to read a lot of books that were written also in the 19th century that you could find either online or in archives, but also pamphlets that were written by bondholders, by French diplomats who were fulminating against Haiti's late payments, double check and cross check the figures in, for instance, a public bank, which is called the Caisse des dépôts et consignations, which was the bank that collected the payments from Haiti. So the idea was that we would collect the data, put that into a spreadsheet, cross-check those figures with as many sources as possible, and step by step build that sort of big spreadsheet that would trace the money starting in 1825 to the end of the 19th century, when that debt was finally paid. We worked with a lot of academics also to vet our tabulations with historians who would provide us some context about, say, what was happening in 1843 when Haiti was struck with a natural disaster and had to stop the payments to France and then resume the payments only 3 years or 4 years later. Those historians would basically explain to us the historical context behind those payments. So in the end, what we found was that Haiti paid a total of 112 million francs on the double debt. So I know that some people here, you'll do the math and you'll think, hold on, 150 million francs, 30 million francs on the loan, that does not add up. The reason for that is that in 1838, the indemnity was actually reduced to 90 million francs. And the payment of the loan was often renegotiated with the bondholders, the French bondholders who owned that loan. There were also interests and late fees that were added to that payment. So in the end, what we found was that Haiti paid 112 million francs. That's about, in terms of today's dollars, that's about more than $500 million in today's dollars. So then the question became, I mean, there was an issue with that figure, $500 million in today's dollars, because if you think about it, that is not a lot compared to Haiti's GDP today, which is about $15 billion, right? It's not huge for a payment that lasted for more than 6 decades. And so we started to talk with economists, and our question was, well, can we figure out a way to basically assess how those payments affected Haiti's economy during those years, but also in the long term? Because when you and I contract a loan, we use it to, say, fund, I don't know, build a house or fund a new project. When states contract a loan, they will fund hospitals or schools. But those payments yielded nothing to Haiti. That was really a zero-sum game for Haiti in a sense. So we wanted to know basically what those payments would have enabled Haiti to do if they had stayed in the country, if they had stayed in Haiti. So some economists, it so happened that some economists in the summer of 2020 had tried to do just that in a research paper that was using broad estimates of Haiti's debt. So what I did basically was drawing from their methodology and using our more precise data. So my first hypothesis was basically to say, well, if that money had stayed in the Haitian economy, it would have at a minimum grown at a rate of return that is equal to Haiti's real GDP growth from 1825 to today, right? Like every year you have a payment that is made to France. Well, if you keep it in Haiti and you grow it every year by 2.1%, which is Haiti's real GDP growth on average every year from 1825 to today, how much is it worth today? So I did that. I used to estimate Haiti's GDP growth on average every year. I used some figures that were some estimates, in fact, that were calculated by a student of Thomas Piketty, the French economist. And in the end, we found that if that money had stayed in Haiti, it would have added at a minimum a $21 billion to Haiti over time. That is from 1825 to today. Now, the issue with that estimate is that you assume that that money grows at a rate of return, which is Haiti's actual rate of return. So you assume that that influx of money does not influence the way the country Haiti's GDP. So one could legitimately assume that this huge amount of money would have probably increased Haiti's growth, right? Compared to the 2.1% that they actually had. And so some economists suggested that we use the higher growth rate, which was the average growth rate of Latin American economies from the early 19th century to today as a rate of return. That growth rate was about 3.2%. So we applied it to our methodology and we found that in the end, Haiti could have had an additional $115 billion over time from 1825 to today. To put things in perspective, that range, $21 billion and $115 billion, that's about 1 to 8 times Haiti's GDP today. So this is it. I try to summarize it as clearly as possible. It's a little bit technical, but I'm very happy to give you more details. Also, more details into the alternative approaches that we try to estimate that long-term cost.
My first reaction is, how did people receive that information? I mean, when you see, just, between 21 to 150 billion, maybe 1 to 8 times the GDP, that's mind-blowing, Constant. How was that received by people?
Well, it's a good question. Actually, people have, my feeling was that people were satisfied that finally we had some, I would say, I hope, solid estimates of the long-term cost of that double debt. Because again, until now, the only figures that we had was that 150 million francs that was paid. In fact, not 150, but 90 million, because that was reduced in the mid-19th century. But that was the only figure we had, and that figure does not help us to understand the long-term economic cost to Haiti. So I think people were satisfied. You have to remember that we're talking about a range that spans 2 centuries, right? We're not saying that Haiti lost tens of billions of dollars every year. We're saying that it lost that amount over 2 centuries. I haven't seen that many people saying, well, France basically owes us, say, $115 billion. Also because it's a debate that the Haitian government has not picked up. It has its own problems. It is also under the influence of some Western countries in Haiti. So I'm not sure that it has all the leverage, in a sense, to pick up that subject and that issue. But yeah, overall, I would say that people were finally maybe happy to have some estimate of the cost. Let me add something, which is that another figure that we had until now was the figure that was presented by former President Aristide in 2003. When he was president of Haiti, he launched that big reparation campaign to get that money back from France. And he used a figure, an estimate of the money that he wanted back from France, which was actually $21 billion. I've had a lot of people telling me, well, you actually just confirmed Aristide's figure. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because Aristide, when he gave that figure, again, we were in 2004, not 2003. So you have to add inflation to that, right? 21 billion in 2004 would probably be around 32 billion today, probably even more because of the current rate of inflation. But it's just to basically prevent comparing oranges with apple.
I have a question.
Excuse me?
I had a question, but you can go ahead.
Okay. We will have time for questions and answers around I would say about 1:45. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you. One of my comments, thinking about this project and the different parts of this project, and you were based in Europe. Catherine, I know she had traveled to Haiti, and then also in the US because of Citibank and some of the financial things that occurred during the US occupation. I guess my other question would be, like, how was it working in these various archives and trying to, it was not only the team of reporters, but the economists, the historians, other scholars, thinking about, that you had to go beyond the archives to find information. So what were some of those challenges? And I also think about the fact that, a lot of this was done last year. So the series comes out, I think, the end of May this year, but you all had been working for over a year on this series. And I just think about, the assassination last year, the different crises that Haiti has been going through, especially last year. What were some of the challenges in terms of, going into the archives, in terms of doing this research?
Right. So there are many questions there. No, it's great. The first question about so we went to archives in France, in the US, and in Haiti. And I personally went only to archives in France. I mean, when it comes to the US and France, it's fairly easy. All you need is knowing where to look, basically. For that, we had great historians who helped us determine which were the most interesting archives to us. I'll talk a little bit about France. There is a great, actually fantastic archival center in central Paris, just next to the Seine River, which are the archives of the Caisse des dépôts et consignations, which is this public bank that collected almost all of the payments on the double debt. Because it's a bank, they kept very precise records of the payments year after year. And that was an absolutely invaluable source for our work. It was also interesting to see the exchange of letters between the finance minister of France and the civil servants at the bank, was the minister basically asking at some point in the early 20th century, when the payment was over, but some former colonizers had actually not requested the money. So the bank was left with about 2 million francs in its hands. And the minister asking, well, what are we going to do with this? Because parliamentarians are going to ask me why we have suddenly an additional 2 million francs in our budget. So it's also funny to see how France, even in the early 20th century, was kind of realizing that it still owned some money from basically Asian descendants of Asian slaves, way after France had abolished slavery. I also went to more, I would say, traditional archives, the national archives, which are in and around Paris. We also had access to private archives from historians and also just history buff in southern France. My colleague Selam Gebrakidan went to archives in the US. As I said, she went to the National Library essentially. And then we had the help of Asian researchers to go and find as many documents on Haiti's budget in the 19th century as possible. We wanted those figures on the budget because we were initially interested in finding how much of Haiti's annual budget those debt payments soaked up. We couldn't eventually find that proportion for a simple reason, which was Haiti was constantly changing its budget over the year. You know, it was basically adding budget lines to respond to emergency crises. So it was impossible to get a sense of what was the actual budget every year of the government. In Haiti, what's for sure is, well, I mean, much of our work was basically done while the country was spiraling into a political crisis a little bit after President Moise was assassinated. So it was sometimes a little bit dangerous for our team on the ground, but we have the support of our own security services. Catherine went there twice to report on the assassination, but also to report for this story. We were grateful that she has a lot of experience in the country. So in the end, that went well. What was your second question? I think I partly answered it, maybe, about the context in Haiti.
Yes, it was about the context in
Right.
Haiti and just the challenges of working in the different archives and with the team.
Right. So just to finish on the context, I think in a sense, you know, we had a question initially inside the team, which was, why are we writing on this in 2021 or 2022, right? Like, we could have written on this in 2012, we could write on this in 2032. There's no reason why now. In a sense, and I would say, unfortunately, what happened in Haiti kind of provided us with that news peg, you know, because for several months, Haiti suddenly came back under the limelight. People's attention refocused on Haiti because of the assassination, because of the crisis with gang violence, because of another natural disaster. And I remember reading some stories at the time before our own project had been published, with people referring to that initial debt and saying, well, we should be careful not to refer to Haiti only as a country that is buffeted by natural disasters, corruption, and endemic violence. It is also a country that had to pay that unique debt. So that kind of helped us, in a sense, to justify, you know, why we're writing on this today. We would have published it anyway right now. We were not waiting for any catastrophe to happen, of course, but I think it helped give a sense of, give a news peg to that project. Regarding your question about working with the team and with economists and historians, so we were four working on this. Catherine was based in Canada. Salam Gebrakidan was based in London. Matt Puzo is based in Brussels, and I was based in Paris. It was actually helpful to have people on two different continents. We were able to go to more archives this way. We were coordinating with WhatsApp and other social networks. And it was also helpful to meet as many historians and economists as possible. So I went to London to meet an historian. Salam and Catherine went several times to the US to do that as well. What was great really was talking to economists and historians about that subject with very different backgrounds. So we talked to historians who had a very sound knowledge of 80s revolutionary period, so that we would have the context about the debt. We talked with historians of contemporary Haiti, so that we would know more about the economic situation of the country today. We would talk to economists who knew not a lot about Haiti, but who had great insight into how to calculate the long-term economic cost of a debt over 2 centuries. And for that, economists such as Thomas Piketty from Paris were extremely useful. They basically helped us build that economic model. They fact-checked all of our formulas in our spreadsheets. So that was really helpful too. In total, we had, I think, 15 economists who vetted our calculations on the long-term economic cost. It was fun to do that, to be honest. As a reporter, you don't often work on mathematical models. So it was also very interesting. And with historians, well, as I said earlier, they were helpful in providing the context about that double debt, also sometimes pointing us to specific documents or archives, challenging our work, in terms of our preconceptions of what that debt was about and how it was used.
One thing that also I think surprised me about this series was that there were, I think, maybe 3 additional shorter articles on just the process and the sources, and thinking about, what you just talked about with conferring with the historians and the different scholars. One article which you wrote was about sort of how you calculated the debt. Another one was, I think it was called Under the Hood, and just talking about just the process. And so my question is, why was that important? Because that's not usual. You don't usually, write about the process and the sources and the resources that you use. So why was that important for this project?
Well, it was important because first, we talked to dozens and dozens of historians and economists. And the law of journalism is that you cannot quote everybody. And so we thought that it was really important that we write this big article called Under the Hood, which is 5,000 word long. So that's basically as long as each part of our series. So that's pretty long for a bibliography, at least for a newspaper. We thought that it was important to refer to all of the books, research papers, and studies that proved crucial to our research. It would have been impossible to do that project without the previous work of historians and economists. Just to give you an example, it would have been impossible to calculate the long-term economic cost without estimates on Haiti's GDP in the 19th century, which was a work that was done by a former thesis student of Thomas Piketty. It would have been impossible to write about the beneficiaries of the payments, the French beneficiaries, without the previous work of a Swiss historian who wrote about the indemnity and who found the names of many of those families. So we really wanted to express our gratitude to those scholars whose work was, again, crucial to our project. That's the first reason. The second reason is that when the New York Times, I think, comes with this sort of big, in a sense, very splashy project, 5 parts, on A1 for a week, we want to show our readers that we put a lot of work into this, and a type of work that is not that common for journalists, that is going into archives, working with economists to calculate long-term costs while using fairly complicated economic formulas, using a lot of data. All of this, we thought, was we wanted to show that we were on solid grounds. And the third reason is that we thought of this project not only as a journalistic project, but also a work that we hope can be used by other researchers and historians. This is why we published all of the data we have collected on the double debt online, because we used the work, as I said before, of historians and economists. We're grateful about this, and we just want to basically advance that research and hope that future historians can similarly use our own work to advance the research on Haiti's debt. So that was also important to us. I remember that, when I met several times with Thomas Piketty, the economist, and his approach to all of his research is to basically publish all of the data that he collects in the hope that other people will come, refine the data, add things, improve the project, improve the research. Well, that's also our hope about this Haiti project. There are many other layers that we haven't touched upon, and we hope that other reporters, historians, economists will research those other topics.
Another thing that I found that was different and I really appreciated was that there is a French translation of the series, but there is also a Creole translation of the series. And I think that is very important in terms of the status of Creole as a language. For many people out there who don't realize that the majority of people in Haiti speak Creole, not French, and that has been used to actually oppress people. People for even into the late 20th century would have to do things in terms of French. If they had to go to government offices, if they got arrested and went to court, it was in French. It was not in Creole. And so when people went to school to get educated, it was in French, not in Haitian Creole. And so for me to see that Creole translation, that was, I felt very hopeful. And so I was curious about the decision around having it translated into Creole, especially since even though, Creole is currently being promoted, a lot of people who read don't read in Creole, but rather read in French. So can you just talk a little bit about why that decision to have the Creole translation?
Right. Well, in fact, that was actually pretty self-evident to us from the very beginning. We usually translate our big investigative stories when they can be of interest to a foreign audience. We do that in French for stories that are about France or about French interests. We also translate in Chinese and Spanish. It would have been inconceivable for us not to translate in Creole when the very subjects of that story are Asian people. So that was clear from the very beginning to us. We also, we know that many people in Haiti also only speak Creole. And well, after all, that story is first and foremost their story, right? So it was important to us that they could read about their own story and also read more details about that story that many know about, but they don't know the details about the actual figures, about the negotiations around the debt up and the repercussions up to the early 21st century. The way we translated it was, Catherine, my colleague, speaks Creole, so she basically oversaw the translation, but we obviously worked with a team of Asian Creole translators that is based in northern Miami. And we were very pleased to see that very quickly, soon after the story was published, we heard reports that the story was actually being read aloud on the Haitian radio in Creole for people who could not access the story online because of a lack of internet connection, not because of a lack of subscription, because the story was free in Creole and in French for any reader. So that was, I mean, to me, that was really the thing that pleased me the most, just to know that some people in villages in Haiti could hear that story on the radio. What else was I going to say? No, yeah, I mean, that's pretty it. Yeah.
One question I also had thinking about the response, has any of the descendants of the plantation owners who were paid received these payments? How have they responded to the story, to the feature, to the series?
It's a great question, because that was part of my job as a France-based reporter, to look for the descendants and basically come and knock on the door and say, hey, have you heard about that? What's interesting is that it's a story that is not known in France, the story of the independence debt. So even the descendants, most of them did not know about that. And when I would contact them, when I would reach out to them, the first response most of the time was that they were just completely surprised to know that first, they were descendants of slavers, and second, that the wealth of their family was partly based on payments that were made way after the abolition of slavery that lasted until the late 19th century. So it was interesting also to see how French people are completely are just not knowledgeable at all about that history. That said, the reactions to that story were different. Some people said, well, we cannot basically right the wrongs. This is not our fault, and in a sense, they're right about this, right? Like, this is a generation, a new generations. It's about their ancestors, and they were basically saying it's just too bad, but we cannot do a lot about this. Other people were saying, well, we should probably, engage in reparations, and I don't see why the French state could not restitute some of that money, or at least invest in some, I don't know, school like or funds to finance schools and big projects in Haiti. So they were thinking within that scheme of reparation and restitution. I'll give you one example that really stayed with me, which is the descendant of the biggest slave owner a French slave owner in Haiti, which as a consequence was also the biggest beneficiary of the payments, because the payments were made based on based on the land that you owned in Haiti, and on the number of slaves that you owned in on the island. It's interesting because that slave owner, who was also a very rich banker in the late 18th century, then his children and grandchildren became politicians, famous politicians, or came to become the head of that bank or that public institution. So it's quite easy to trace basically their history. Well, that descendant, who's about my age, is about 25, I think, didn't know about that story. But the first thing he said was, well, we have this tendency in France to erase from our memory the history that does not please us. And he made a comparison with the war in Algeria. France was a colonizer in Algeria for over a century, and it's still a very sensitive topic in France, the legacy of that colonial presence, and then the war that ensued in the 1950s and 1960s. And he said, well, you know, when I went to school, when I went to middle school, I didn't learn about the war in Algeria because it was too sensitive. And he said, I wish I had learned about that history in Haiti in those books instead that learning it from you, you know, because that would have helped me not only in reacting more in a more thoughtful way, you know, instead of just being surprised and not really knowing what to think, but also in terms of debating it with my family. One last thing. It turns out that one of the descendants of that banker and former slave owner turned out to sit on the committee of a French bank, which is called the on the committee of the Haitian National Bank, which was created by a French bank, the Crédit Industriel et Commercial. This is the topic of an entire story in our project. And so basically you had a beneficiary from the payments who sat on the committee of the Haitian National Bank, whose primary goal was to make sure that the payments on the debt were rightly made to France in the 19th century. So you can see basically how that loop was created also in the 19th century, and how the interests of the former colonizers were defended in the late 19th century by other institutions and other banks that made sure that those payments would be paid, and that made sure that this sort of relation of financial dependency between Haiti and France was maintained throughout the 19th century.
And one last question before we open it up to the audience. Because this was such a big project, what did you take away from it? What did you learn from being part of this project and working on this project?
I think the main takeaway was that it only takes some solid work to change a narrative about a country. The narrative about Haiti has always been about, you know, if there's the sort of catchphrase about Haiti, it has long been the poorest country in the Western hemisphere. And that's all. And sometimes you would hear about corruption, natural disasters, and violence, but you would never hear about that independence debt. And I think what I'm mostly satisfied with is that with that story, with that project, I hope partly helped change the narrative around that country, and told readers and people interested in Haiti that there's also a backstory that is a story of financial dependence that lasted for decades. That is a story about reparations that went to slave owners and not to former slaves. That is a story about neocolonialism, and that all of this has also shaped Haiti and partly made what it is today. And that when you think about it, when you think about Haiti in 2022, you must also think about that backstory to truly understand what happened to that country.
Thank you. So if you have a question, please share in the chat. Okay, so here's a question from Stephanie Mitchell. This is not a question. This is a sincere gesture of gratitude for this very important work that you and your team are doing. It is meaningful and deeply appreciated. All right.
Thanks,
So,
Stephanie.
okay, John B. Gray, have there been protections if Haiti were to become a UN protectorate? Have there been projections if Haiti were to become a UN protectorate?
What I'm not sure to understand the question. What do you mean by projections? Projections in terms of
John, can you ask the question? Would that work better?
Thank you kindly. And I'm going to renew my subscription to the New York Times. I thought I wasn't reading it enough. I heard on NPR a while back, 2 years ago back when Haiti spun, that one possibility was to have the United States make Haiti, not by its own wishes, a UN protectorate, sort of imposing a Roman law over the country for 100 years, and people would hate that and it'd be terrible and wrong and politically incorrect, and people, but to reestablish some sort of order in that way. And I wanted to throw that in there because I heard that as a possibility. I hope they don't become anyway. But and wondering if your research, which is really great because it's so wide, has gone into that future possibility. I hope I said that right.
right, yeah, that's clear that way. Thanks.
Okay.
I was not aware of those of that possibility. I honestly doubt that it will happen, at least in the short term. What's clear about the state of Haiti today is that I mean the country is in a deep state of political crisis. There is a president whose mandate is contested because he was not elected after the assassination of President Moïse. And it's also a president who was kind of appointed with the support and agreement of Western countries such as the US, Canada, and France. So there is, I would say, still a lot of leverage for activity for Western countries in Haiti, not only in the humanitarian sphere, but also in the political domain. When you say that the US might try to basically take over Haiti with through some sort of a UN agreement, again, I don't think that's really foreseeable, but I cannot help but thinking about the last time the US did that, which is also the topic of one of our stories, when in the early 20th century, the US invaded Haiti based on the reasoning that the country was mismanaging its finances and that it needed a better management of budget and of its trade. And that ended up being the US longest colonization of a country in all its history. So I doubt that the US would like to reproduce that example even within the framework of the United Nations.
Thank you so much for that, and I hope not too. Yeah, another one, a quickie might be a more karmic guilt with when I learned about Citibank, stepping in, doing all that. So I won't get a Citibank credit card anyway. Thank you so much for that time together. Thank you.
Thanks.
Our next question is, can you talk a little more about how Haiti agreed or was forced to make the payments?
Sure. So in basically the idea around Haiti paying France an indemnity emerged in the early 19th century around the years of 1810s, 1820s. As you know, Haiti became independent in 1804 after beating the forces of Napoleon in Haiti. In the years after that independence, the country was constantly under pressure from France, but also other European countries such as Great Britain. They were basically excluded from international trade because that was the first Black country that became independent. And that was a precedent that European countries just did not want. At the time, slavery was not yet abolished. Fairly quickly, there were talks between Haiti and France about paying an indemnity so that Haiti would be formally recognized as independent by France once it had paid that indemnity to the former colonizers who were expelled from the island after its independence. There were several amounts that were mentioned, 90 million francs, 100 million francs. And then in 1825, while the talks had basically stalled between Haiti and France, France came with a flotilla of 14 military ships, if I'm not mistaken. The head of that flotilla had a very clear message to the Haitian government. He said, and this is from the report that we obtained, the report that he wrote about that trip to Haiti, he said, "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to impose that debt on you. That is a 150 million francs debt to pay to Haiti in 5 installments over 5 years. As we'll see, that debt was eventually paid over more than 6 decades. But I'm here to impose that debt, or that will be war between France and Haiti." So what was initially some sort of a negotiation between two countries that stalled, it's very impossible to say whether Haiti would have agreed to pay in the end, because there were also some tensions between different leaders in the country, became a debt that was mainly forced upon the country. In the years after the debt was signed into some sort of an official document, there were several episodes of rebellion in the country against the government for basically caving in and agreeing to pay that debt.
Okay, our next question from Larry Vance. Julie mentioned earlier that this is mind-blowing. I agree. My question is, why haven't the UN stepped in? And then the second question is, will someone please explain what happened to President Jean Aristide and why? Well, I don't know if Constant can answer why the UN hasn't stepped in, because that's kind of beyond the topic, but you could talk about what happened to Aristide.
Thanks, Hermit. Indeed, I'm not sure I can. I'm not in the minds of the UN. I'm not sure they would step in. It's a little bit, yeah. It's difficult to say. So what happened to President Jean-Bertrand Aristide? So Aristide, as you know, was first elected in the early 1990s. Then he was deposed in a coup, fled to the US, came back with the support of the American administration to Haiti, and was re-elected to a second term as president in 2001. What Aristide and his aides told us was that while he was in the US, he started to get interested in the history of that debt. When he came back to Haiti, when he was re-elected as president, he thought that he needed to raised the issue of the reparation and the restitution, which he did in a speech in 2003, where he mentioned that debt, and then in 2004, when he gave a precise figure for the restitution he was asking, that is those $21 billion I mentioned earlier. Then what happened is a little bit murky. Aristide's power was contested in the country by political opponents, but also by armed gangs. In late 2003 and then in early 2004, the country really spiraled into a political crisis. Gangs and armed rebels took over some cities and villages in the country. And it seemed like that Aristide lost the support of Western nations, including France and the US. Aristide in February 2004 was then basically exiled from his own country, put on a plane with the help of France and the US, sent to Africa.
It seems like did Constant freeze?
Yes, he did.
Okay. Let's give him a second and let's see what happens.
Yeah, and we're a little past time, so if Constant isn't able to come back in a moment. Looks like he's signed off. Let's see if he comes back in. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can. Thank you.
Sorry, Braca, for a few seconds. What I was saying is about Aristide. So what's interesting in terms of the link with the debt is that there are two former French ambassadors in Haiti at the time who told us basically that there was a small connection with Aristide's request to get that money back. One ambassador who was there when Aristide first voiced that restitution request told us that it was really annoying for France and that they basically tried to nip the request in the bud. The second ambassador who was there when Aristide was exiled from his own country told us, I don't have the exact quote in my mind, that it was also partly, I quote, about the restitution request. So there's also, this sort of background about the debt and the restitution, which surprisingly still played a role up until the 21st century in the fate and in the political situation of the country.
Okay, and this is our last question. Can you talk about the recent request Haiti made to France for reparations? You kind of did that. Do you have a sense if your story has helped foster any public support in France for French reparation to Haiti?
So I guess when you mentioned the recent request Haiti made to France for reparation, that's actually Aristide's request. So I think I've covered that ground already. I cannot think of any other recent request. In fact, after Aristide was exiled from Haiti, he's the president, the head of state that took over Haiti, said publicly that they were dropping that request, and no other president since then has picked up the topic. Has our story helped foster any public support in French for reparations? It's hard to say. I know that it's been talked about in government circles, that it's been talked about by foundations that work on reparation for slavery. I know that some activists have talked about that. I cannot say, I don't think that there's been a movement about reparations to Haiti in France at the moment, nor has there been movement about that in Haiti as well. Also because Haiti is in the throes of a bigger crisis at the moment. So I think it's basically been part of the debate on reparations, not only for Haiti, but for former colonies. It's not been part of a more specific and focused debate about reparations to Haiti.
Okay. Constant, I want to just say thank you. Thank you for spending the time with us and talking to us about this project and your work on this project. This has been amazing, and it's just been amazing for me as well, and I know for our audience. And I just want to tell everyone, if you're interested, read the series. It's an amazing series. And for the scholars out there, I mean, the resources are there. I mean, even you put the spreadsheet on GitHub, right?
GitHub, yeah.
GitHub. And so, I mean, it's all there and it's all accessible and available. So it's just amazing. And so just thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you
for inviting me.
well.
Thank you, Constant.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me. It was great to talk to you about that.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.